So in the first one, we had, look at a few things. For Canada, we want to look at how GDP is doing. So one thing for Canada, an easy data, luckily Bank of Canada estimates, and that is our output gap. Bank of Canada calculates, it tells us if it's a positive or negative output gap, right? So let's jump to that. Where do you go? Maybe it's coming later. This is employment survey, so that's one thing. That's employment survey. Then we wanted inflation in Canada. This is the inflation. Okay. Then output gap must be a bit maybe earlier or in the next. I don't see. Maybe it's in the other file. So let's look at it here. Here, this is the output gap. The Bank of Canada estimates the difference between our actual and potential GDP. And then finally, so we have the three indicators: GDP, real GDP, we have inflation rate, and we have unemployment rate. Now let's look at policies. So policy for fiscal policy is look at debt to GDP ratio. I have these indicators, these links. And I'm going to open one by one. I'm just going to tell you how to use these perhaps. Of course, you're free to use your own resources as long as they're credible. But these are good stuff also. They come from World Bank, they come from IMF and so on. And so I'm going to open all of these. Bank of Canada policy rates. And then, okay. So let me get rid of these. So starting with GDP. This is output gap, right? I'm going to also look at the ones that are current. And let me expand this a little bit more. Let me also turn off maybe this slide. No. All right, so here, you see starting with GDP. We said the output gap, which is the difference between actual and potential GDP, tells us if you are in a recessionary or inflationary gap, right? You see here, actual GDP is greater than potential GDP. This is output gap. So this is graphing output gap, this one. They graphed output gap, which is actual minus potential GDP for any year, for any given year, right? They graphed it. So prior to that Great Recession, we had a positive output gap. That is, our actual GDP was greater than our potential GDP, right? This also means during that same period, our unemployment rate must have been less than natural unemployment rate, right? Because we have a positive output gap here. Positive output gap, producing more than potential, our employment more than full employment. Unemployment rate, less than natural unemployment rate during this period. During that same period, then we have a positive output gap. Generally, we have inflation. Why we call it an inflationary output gap? Because when you have too few people unemployed, there's going to be upward pressure on wages. That's going to translate in upward pressure on prices. So during the same period, you might have inflationary pressure. So policy, if you look at the policy perhaps around that time, would be to cool down the economy. How do you cool down the economy? By lowering aggregate demand through contractionary fiscal and monetary policies. So So that's that part. Then here we had that Great Recession that came to our economy through our net export. From the US, right? Economy came to our economy, spilled over to our economy through that, to our net export. And so here you see a negative output. You have a large negative output gap. This is what we call a recessionary output gap. And because 2 consecutive quarters at least where we experience decrease in our actual GDP, we call that a recession, right? So we have now a negative output gap, meaning our unemployment rate is greater than our natural unemployment, right? Because we are producing less than our potential, our employment must be less than full employment. Meaning that unemployment must be greater than natural unemployment, right? So here, if you look at the unemployment rate, you see large unemployment rate here. So if you want to address this, the direction of policy would be expansionary. To close this output gap, this time a negative output gap, a recession output gap, you need to push the economy forward, stimulate the economy. We use a stimulus, we call it, right? So expansionary fiscal and monetary policy, if you're looking at it. Here, contractionary, meaning that we should see our interest rate, the policy, monetary policy, to go up, tightening. Our budget should be more like surplus. We run surpluses here. This is the opposite. Here, if you look at the interest rate policy rate, should be going down, right? To easing, for easing, not tightening this time. Monetary policy. And then fiscal policy, we will be running deficits. So here is restored, all good. Another negative, major negative output gap here that you want to interfere. Around this time, you might not want to actively interfere much. So you might not see a policy, the direction in the policy very clear. But here you are going to see again, this is a COVID time. So we want to again help close the negative recessionary output gap. How do you do it? With expansionary policy. If you look at our policy, fiscal policy, you're going to see again government that is running a deficit. How did we see it? We said, let's look at debt to GDP ratio. If you're running a deficit, your debt is growing, right? That's been an expansionary fiscal policy. If you're running a surplus, your debt is declining, contractionary, right? So here we expect expansionary fiscal policy, right? Growing debt, also expansionary monetary policy, lowering policy rate, right? And then in this period, again, we have a positive output gap. What should we expect? If you want to address it here, positive output gap, again, unemployment rate below natural unemployment rate. Inflation perhaps is accelerating. How do we fight it? Through contractionary fiscal and monetary policy. And lately, we are experiencing a negative output gap again. So we expect unemployment rate here to be greater than natural. We know the last data on unemployment rate was about 6.7%. If we estimate natural unemployment rate in Canada to be about 6%, 6.7% greater than natural unemployment rate, right? Meaning that our employment is less than full employment, meaning that our GDP is less than our potential GDP, hence the negative output gap. All right? So let's look at some of these episodes. For example, like this period, around in year 2000, and these are quarterly data, around 2022, say. Let's look at 2022. That's when we had a positive output gap, right? Positive output gap, that is our unemployment rate should be less than natural unemployment rate, right? Let's look at that data for unemployment. This is labor force a little bit. I'm going to look at go to categories. This is, and go to labor force survey, and let's look at unemployment. This is employment rate. This is unemployment. And then look at specifically around 2020. You see, our unemployment rate is at minimum. If our natural unemployment rate is estimated to be around 6%, here, as we expected, when we had a positive output gap, our unemployment rate is less than our natural unemployment rate. Okay, so that's one thing. We are experiencing an inflationary output gap, positive output gap, right? During the same period, let's look at our inflation rate around 2022, when we had a positive output gap. Look at our inflation. Let me also get rid of some of these to look at core and headline. So headline inflation, you see this is 2022. Our inflation went to about 8.1%, way above our target, 2%. Our core, that what policy looks at, 5.7, way above the 1 to 3% range that we are comfortable with, right? So you see all this period of positive output gap with unemployment rate that is less than natural unemployment rate, and with inflation rate that is higher than the target. So what would be the focus of the policy? What should we do here? Contractionary policy, fiscal and monetary policy, contractionary. Meaning that if we observe this, we need to increase our cost of borrowing, right? That would be a quantitative tightening. That would be increasing cost of borrowing, lowering the liquidity in the economy. Okay? So that's a contraction in monetary policy. So we should see a policy rate to go up during that period we're going to look at. So that's monetary policy. Let's do that. Monetary policy is right. That's it. There you go. This is a. Let me also get rid of this one. This is our monetary policy, and then this is around 20. This is 2022. You see, so we observe that Bank of Canada start to aggressively increase the interest rate because if we observe the inflation, so we started increasing. That's tightening, increasing cost of borrowing. It went up to around 5%. 5%, right? Now they're lowering it. They're lowering it because our fight against inflation is over. Like inflation rate now, we are seeing that. Where is it? Inflation. You see, it's now it's in the range that we are comfortable with. So our focus now is no longer inflation. Our unemployment is not too high. It's about 6.7% or so. Here, you see about 6.7% right now. It's not way above the 6% that we are comfortable with. Remember, the mandate of Bank of Canada is to fight inflation, so they're done with that. Now maybe they can turn their focus on the economy if they feel the economy is slowing down too much. So that's one thing, but the main mandate will be inflation, fighting inflation. Okay? Now, right now, if you listen, or perhaps in the previous couple of meetings of Bank of Canada, they said we want to bring the policy rate to the point that is neutral. What does that mean? What does it mean a policy rate, a cost of borrowing that is neutral? That is not expansionary, neither expansionary nor contractionary, right? So they feel the economy is back on the long run path. But things can change, right? If, for example, the tariffs are imposed, send our economy into a recession, then Bank of Canada is going to do what? Use expansion monetary policy to fight it, to help restore the equilibrium, right? The long run equilibrium. And so that's just a period here, the period of positive output gap, right? That was here. When we had negative, let's look at this period, 2008, 2009, right? This is a large negative output gap, right? If he, well, my policy rate, let's see, my unemployment rate, yes, it's more recent, so I don't want, let's look at just this one. This is a negative output gap, large negative output gap, when we had, focus on this period here. This is during COVID, right? We have a large negative output gap. How do we find it? Find it with expansionary policy. Expansionary policy, monetary policy would be, where is here? We're having interest rate near zero. Essentially, we hit the bottom of the maximum, basically, what we could do with monetary policy. Our interest rate went all the way to zero, our nominal interest rate, right? We can't bring it lower than that, so it's not enough. We need to also have fiscal policy. I'm going to talk about it momentarily, right? So this is that period of expansionary monetary policy. We're helping the economy to recover from COVID. Because we had negative output gap, look at unemployment rate. It's around 14.1%, way above our natural unemployment rate. So the focus here, we don't have inflation back then. Where's consumer price index? Here. Look at it. We don't have inflation here. We had episodes of deflation even. a little bit, right? So we are not, the Bank of Canada said, we are not, there's no inflation to fight. My focus would be to help the economy to grow, to lower the unemployment rate and so on. Right? So that's why we have those zero policy rate around this time. When we are fighting unemployment, we are closing a negative output gap, expansionary monetary policy. Now let's bring the other one, fiscal policy. So fiscal policy, I said, look at debt to GDP ratio. I brought both of these because look, for Canada, it's important not to just look at the central government debt, but look at the entire government. Because we have a federal government, but we have a provincial government which is massive. So a lot of sectors in Canada are under provincial jurisdiction. Education, healthcare, and all these they're under provincial government. So they have their own budgets. So if you look at this, this would be misleading, right? So Canada, for example, if you look at this, it's going to have a 45% debt to GDP, very low. But this is just a federal. So forget about this. Look at the overall general government debt. Now, you see it's more like 1.8% of our GDP, debt to GDP ratio. More at par with UK, US, say, and France. So Germany is very low, and then France is very low, high. So these are, you see they have two different types of, even though these are the largest economies in Europe, they're like how different they are in terms of their fiscal, basically discipline and culture and so on. But there's an argument that pressure on France's government to lower their debt to GDP ratio, spend less, cut some of those government programs. On Germany, is pressure to increase some of your government programs and so on and help with the economy. So that's that. I wanted to mention how different they can be. You see, Japan is like this Asian economy. Their labor force is shrinking, so just the population increasingly is dependent on government basically expenditure. So they're postponing, pushing down, basically pushing forward their problems essentially to next generations to deal with. So that's that. So let's get rid of some of these and focus more on Canada, the case that we want to look at. So you see, this is that period that we have a jump in our debt to GDP ratio. That's the same period as, and then we had the large negative output gap due to COVID. So that's an large expansionary fiscal policy. You see, you can see in other countries to more or less to some extent. After COVID, we used expansionary fiscal policy. Then during the time that we had a positive output gap, see our debt to GDP decreased. Why? Because now we are dealing with a positive output gap. We are using contractionary fiscal policies. We are running surpluses. Okay? So you can see that how these reports are going to inform government decisions. And when we look at these reports, we anticipate the government's decision to take what direction. And look, these reports, they come at different times, right? You see, maybe tomorrow you get one report, and a few weeks later, one report about labor, force survey, the other one, a few weeks later about inflation, a few weeks later about GDP and so on, right? And based on every time that you get these reports, you update your expectation about the economy. The thing is, and particularly the policy rate, we don't know what the policy rate is going to be. We know right now it's 3.25%, Bank of Canada's rate. We don't know what is it going to become with certainty. Bank of Canada doesn't tell us because they don't know with certainty. They know with some likelihood, and then they tell you if the economy takes the same trend, this happens in the economy, the unemployment rate goes in this direction, inflation goes in the direction, GDP, then we're going to do this. They don't even tell you exactly because they can't. So what we do, like you see in the media, the economists, analysts, and tell you, they form expectations about, based on the reports, current information, suppose we have it, based on the current unemployment rate, the 6.7% inflation rate, the headline 1.8, the core inflation, so 2.5% and so on. Based on that, suppose we say that we expect with some probabilities, with some scenarios, some probabilities that the interest rate look like this and this and this and that, right? So right now, today, say interest rate is 3.25%. So we said in the next meeting, I'm making up these numbers. But this is pretty much, when you look at it, it's like that. So with this probability, for example, with a 40% probability, you're thinking that Bank of Canada is going to cut its interest rate by 25 basis points. So it's 3.25, it's going to become 3 by 40% probability. So that interest rate is going to be 3%. By, say, 30% probability, you think Bank of Canada is going to become more aggressive. Cut not by 25 basis points, but by 50 basis points, for example, right? If they cut by 50 basis points, the interest rate is going to look like, it's going to become what? 2.75, right? 2.75. So with 30% probability, we are thinking that it's going to become 2.75. Suppose with another 30% probability, you're thinking that they're not going to change the interest rate. No cut. And so no cut is going to stay the same as 3.25. And with 0 probability, they're going to increase interest rate. And so say 3.5. Now, how do you calculate your expected interest rate? You multiply each probability by the interest and add them up. You multiply these and add them up. That is going to give you your expected interest rate. Based on that expected interest rate, you do your stock and bond evaluation and so on. You keep in mind, like, you know, what the variable, for example, mortgage rate is going to look like and so on, right? So based on these. Now, suppose a report is dropped. A report is dropped that says for example, the unemployment rate actually takes a turn. From 6.7 goes down to, for example, 6.1. The economy created a lot of jobs. Or the inflation, the core inflation from 2.5 goes to 3.1, 3.2. Like, I'm being extreme a little bit. So if a report such as this come out, then how do you think that is going to perhaps change our expectation? If we see that inflation goes back up and we feel that it's actually a concern, again, an inflationary pressure in the economy for whatever reason, unemployment is going down, inflation is going up, that means the economy is accelerating. So then we adjust these, and then if the economy is accelerating, it is going to become very unlikely for Bank of Canada to cut by 50 basis points. So we adjust these probabilities. Instead of 30, maybe 5%, 10%, there's a chance that based on what number that we just saw, an increase in inflation, a decrease in unemployment, is going to be very unlikely the Bank of Canada cut by 50 basis points. So we adjust these, maybe we make this 10. We make this maybe 15, right? We increase this. Because if inflation is a concern, Bank of Canada is going to perhaps not cut interest rate, maybe actually even increase it if that's a continuous concern, that if that's a trend in the economy. On the other hand, if the report comes out and an inflation rate from 1.8 right now, the headline, and the core from 2.5 drops to say 1.9, the headline drops to say 0.8, a massive drop in inflation. Unemployment rate from 6.7 goes to 7.8%. What does that tell you? That means the economy is slowing down too much. Bank of Canada, you expect to be more aggressive in their expansionary policy, right? So you adjust these, so no, with the current data, I expect this to be even more likely. Maybe you increase this to say 70, 60, 50, 80% chance that Bank of Canada is going to actually cut by 50 basis points. Right? Well, this is 0, but then not cutting, maybe 0. There's no chance they're not going to cut if inflation goes all of a sudden, to say 0.8, unemployment above 7%. Definitely going to cut. So this is how we look at these scenarios, how we read these reports. So every time a report is dropped, we kind of update our expectation about how the policy rate is going to look like in the next cycle and in the next plenary meetings for the rest of the year and so on. Does it make sense a little bit? Okay, great. So now you're able to talk about this stuff when you're looking at these measures in terms of policy and so on. So if you're around, you're out of time. But if you have a few